Good morning, everyone. Happy Easter and welcome to the Forum. My name is Peter Thompson and I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy at St. Bart's. We do not normally have a forum on Easter morning. There is normally a lot going on in this building and a lot of people moving in and out, and we just don't have the time or capacity. But today is not an ordinary Easter, and we're happy to bring you this forum this morning so we can explore the connection between the resurrection and what we're living through right now. And we're thrilled to have with us our own rector, the Right Reverend Dean Wolfe. Bishop Wolfe, good morning to you, and thanks for joining us.
Well, good morning, Peter. It's good to be here, and we thought we'd take the opportunity for those of you who are watching from home and might turn to this channel a little early, that we'd give you an opportunity to hear what's been going on over the past couple of weeks and to ask any questions you have. This has been a really remarkable time for all of us. We were joking earlier that the theme of today's services might be "The Lord is risen anyway." In spite of all the challenges, it is Easter Sunday, and it feels like Easter Sunday in some ways here. So Ellen and I are fine. People have been concerned. We're in good health, and our son is in Dallas and sheltering in place, and he's finishing his second semester of second year of law school virtually, and he's doing fine. I'd say the esprit de corps here on the parish staff is very high. People are remarkably responding to the challenges we've had. I've been so fortunate, and many of you have written to remind me how fortunate I am to have people like Peter and Susan and Deborah and Chris and Andrew and John on the clergy staff. So we feel very fortunate about that. There have been some remarkable learnings over the past several weeks. Who knew that live streaming services would be so popular? We've had, I was trying to look, Peter, you may have these numbers more in your head than I do, but we had some 80,000 people view our morning and evening meditations. I mean, that's just remarkable. And our Sunday morning services have been seen by people not only all over New York, but all over the United States and all over the world. Peter, do you remember some of the numbers for the live streaming?
We're reaching several thousand views for most of our live streams between the various platforms, and that just now I'm not sure how many of those views are the same people, but we're certainly reaching at least 200 to 300 people live, and then many more later, and so we're reaching a lot of you, and we're really grateful that you're tuning in and joining us.
Yeah, that's been a learning, and we're finding out that people are also interested in classes that are live stream, and we've had some very interesting classes with people who have dialed in from home. So I think at the end of this, whatever that looks like, I think a presence online will be an important part of our ministry going forward. It's also been interesting, just I think spiritually, to have a fast from the kind of worship that we sometimes take for granted, or I can say I have taken for granted. I am so used to coming on Sunday and seeing everyone and shaking hands and kind of being the encouragement that comes from that kind of contact on an average Sunday. And the loss of that has been significant. And I've really been grateful for the different ways that people have found to stay connected in this time. And we'll get better at that as time goes on. We had hoped to maybe do a Zoom gathering at the end of our Sunday worship this morning, but we were a little concerned that we may not be able to guarantee the security of that call. So we're working on all of those things. But it's been a loss to not have the congregation present and to not see all of you. And I've appreciated the emails of people saying, we miss you. And I'd just say, well, we miss you right back.
Yeah, I will second that. I was very surprised by the volume of emails, just showing how many of you are participating and engaging with our services. It feels a little lonely here, especially this Easter morning, with just a handful of us here. But we also sort of feel you out there in the World Wide Web. And we know you're out there because you tell us on our social media platforms, you tell us through email. It's been a very strange experience learning this new way of being church.
Right. So this is an interesting Easter to proclaim the resurrected Lord in the midst of so much loss and the deep tragedy of so many people having died because of the COVID-19 virus. We are ministering to people in our congregation who have lost loved ones. Almost all of us now know someone who has died or someone who's been really critically ill. We continue to offer pastoral care in various ways, by phone, by Zoom, still occasionally by the old-fashioned letter or note. And I think that's been it's just been a very, I find myself saying this over and over, and I'm comforted by the fact that other people are saying it too. It's just not like anything that any of us have ever experienced. And I suspect that the effects of this will stay with us individually, spiritually, but also will inform the ministry of the church for years to come.
So we have close to 80 folks watching online currently between our two platforms. And I encourage you, if you have questions for Bishop Wolf, to leave them in the comments on either YouTube or Facebook. I'm monitoring those, and we'll be sure to ask him your questions on your behalf. You can also email your questions to me at pthompson@stbarts.org. Again, that's pthompson@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for those questions, Bishop Wolf, what has changed in your understanding of Easter this year? We're going to hear a sermon from you in a couple minutes, but how is Easter different from you, your understanding of the resurrection?
Yeah, I think in years past, I've maybe thought more about the resurrection in terms of Christ rising from the dead, and of course that's at the core of it. But I've also been thinking about the resurrection in terms of the ways that we are resurrected, that the deaths and the brokenness and the losses that we experience in life are also resurrected. And I think this year I've thought a lot more about that side of the resurrection. You know, it's interesting, and I'll say something about this in the sermon. I've been doing this for a while, and it's interesting. Christian Century used to have a series of theologians talking, and the title of the series was "How My Mind Has Changed." And I always found that fascinating, because I think as you study these things, as you reflect, as you grow, your mind does change, and your concept. when I was very young, the bodily resurrection, the physics of it all were interesting to me. I'm not as interested in that at this stage in my life. I'm more interested in the ways that I can experience resurrection in my life, in my relationships, the way I can demonstrate resurrected behavior in terms of the concern I have for my brothers and sisters. So yeah, and this year, things that you think are essential for Easter, it turns out that Easter comes and those things aren't essential. So it's been an interesting letting go of some things.
We took our title for this forum from the commendation at the end of the burial service, from that anthem, "All of us go down to the dust, yet even at the grave we make our song, Alleluia, Alleluia." And at the end of every funeral service, that really gets me, this sort of tension that we're faced with the finitude of our lives, with our own mortality, and yet we still praise, because at any funeral we're grieving the loss of a loved one, but we're also rejoicing in the promise of resurrection. And is that a tension you're especially aware of this year?
Well, I like the passage in the prayer book that talks about funerals as celebrations, that there's a quality to Anglican Episcopal funerals that emphasize that. And it's not that, I think the term they use is, it's not that grief is unchristian. It's that we have this other gift that allows us to put death in a different perspective. There have been a lot of really interesting conversations among my friends and among my family about death in these past number of weeks. And a very touching conversation with my son, who's very worried about us being in New York. And I said, you've got to really understand that I'm doing something that I deeply believe in. I've had an extraordinarily blessed life, and if I were to die, and I don't have any plans, but if that were to happen, it's not the end of the story, and it's good to be reminded of that, I think.
I do encourage those of you who have questions to send them in via Facebook or YouTube or email. Some folks, Bishop Wolf, have highlighted the connection between the empty tomb and empty churches this morning. I wonder if that has any resonance with you.
Well, there's been some really creative theological thinking. I don't know that I would have come upon some of these concepts and on my own. I was really impressed by the language around Lenten fasting, and it became a part of my own understanding of this period of time. If you take the metaphor of the empty tomb, it's to suggest then that the church has risen along with Christ, and we're not in church, but we're out in the world, caring for people and expressing our love and caring for people who need our attention. I think that would be a wonderful way of thinking about the Christian community on this day. It's really frustrating, of course, whenever Christianity is in the news. There's usually a lot of time devoted to for example, the churches that refuse to close on this Easter, who believe that God will protect them and that they must have worship. And I think about how unchristian that kind of thinking is. So that's sort of the complete opposite of the kind of selfless love for others that I think Christ was teaching us about.
It's also been pointed out that there weren't glorious services of worship on that first Easter morning with great big brass bands.
Right.
That in fact, as we see in today's gospel reading from Matthew, that folks were quite afraid. People were fearful. They didn't know entirely what the outcome was that first Easter morning. And in some ways, this is bringing us back to that experience.
Well, it's pretty clear to me that the disciples did not anticipate the resurrection. Jesus may have been telling them, he may have been teaching about it, but no one among that earliest group around him, I think, could have even imagined such a thing. And you can see the confusion and the fear and also the joy, which is all mixed together in the resurrection narratives.
So we have a question, which is an intimidating one, but I'll just put it right out there. Where is God in this? Where is God in this pandemic? How do we make sense of a God that allows this to happen?
Yeah. I believe God is exactly where God has always been, where God was when his own son is crucified, tortured, put to death. God is with us. God doesn't protect us from all of these things. There's no magic involved in the God that I worship. You can't help but think when innocent people die, these tragedies in these nursing homes, really dozens of people dying and not able to be surrounded by family and friends at their death. There are monstrous things that happen in the world. And the problem of evil has been one that's occupied more than a few theologians over the years. How can you reconcile these two things? I believe that God gives us the ability to care for others, the ability to be compassionate, the ability to be humble, the ability to be kind. And those are the things that become, in the end, expressions of God. All of us, in some ways, channeling God's spirit in that way. Channeling, I realize, needs to be unpacked as a theological term, but I think there is a way in which we make God manifest by our actions on a daily basis.
A kind of corollary to that question: how does this pandemic we're currently living through, how does it affect our own relationship with God? How can our relationship with God become intensified, but how can it also become strained under what we're living?
Well, it's an interesting moment, because there is the opportunity for most of us to have some silence, to engage in disciplines of prayer. People who haven't been able to say the morning or evening offices, Compline, find that they can do that now. I think there's a monastic quality to the way we're living our lives. We're all living kind of in a cloistered way. And that gives you the opportunity to do one of two things. You can sort of spiral into a kind of a pit of despair. And, I've had a few days that were not my best. I don't know if I reached the bottom, but I just, felt exhausted and tired and depressed. But there's also the opportunity to be more closely engaged with God in prayer, to sense God's presence in your life in a much more vibrant and real way. So I think in every crisis there is opportunity, and whether we take advantage of the opportunity given to us, it'll be interesting to see. I keep thinking that I will never take for granted a simple dinner with a group of friends, or a night out at a restaurant, or even a picnic with family. But boy, we do tend to forget pretty quickly. And so one of the things, one of the features of the Christian faith is the need to remember and to recall.
Yeah, it does seem that folks have been participating in worship, dare I say, even more than they were in person. And certainly given what my social media feeds look like, people are engaged in prayer in a whole different way, that folks are taking advantage of this opportunity.
I think so. And there's something about being in church with the opportunity to pad across the living room and get a second cup of coffee and come back. And, I think there's a relaxed quality about that invites people in, or I hope it does.
So we have two questions about how this crisis is affecting operations at St. Bart's. One of the questions is about pastoral care, specifically with the sick and dying. How does that work if clergy are not allowed in hospitals, et cetera? There's also a question about how St. Bart's is faring financially. Has giving dropped? What are the sort of costs associated with this crisis for St. Bart's and with Crossroads?
Yeah, great. Well, those are, as you might imagine, the kinds of questions that occupy most every hour of every day here. In terms of the pastoral care, it's been very important for me to communicate to the congregation that we are available to you. And people have called, they've sent emails. It's harder for us to be in touch. We have to do it by phone or by Zoom usually. But I think those encounters are really important. And I think all of the clergy have had pastoral encounters that have been important. We made it a goal to contact every parishioner that we have a name and number for. And we're still in the midst of that significant project. But in making those calls, I've come across people who were sick, who wanted prayer, and who very much appreciated just getting a call from someone at St. Bart's. So pastoral care, this is an interesting. We're delivering pastoral care in a very different way, but I believe that it's effective. And I know in my own life when I've been ill, part of it is just knowing that somebody's thinking about me, praying for me, checking in on me, and I hope we're being able to do that. In terms of the operations of the church, this is an extraordinarily complex entity. St. Bart's has done an extraordinary job of finding ways to meet costs by renting the church to various entities, by renting space. Of course, all of that income is lost to us in this moment. We we will need for people in the congregation to prayerfully consider increasing their pledge. We will need to cultivate some larger gifts. I think people have traditionally been very generous with us, but the kind of income that we receive from guests in worship, from visitors, it just won't be coming to us. So we're still, I think, looking at our costs and how we can go the distance. We've been able to continue paying our employees, which I think is an important matter of justice. Many of our staff are working harder now than they have ever worked. Some of the staff can't work from home, but most can. And that's been an important motivator for me to find resources so we can continue to pay hardworking people their wage. We're going to know more over the next 30 days, I think. We'll see what happens at Easter, and we've made appeals to the congregation. The wardens have sent an email, I've sent an email, and there have been responses to those that are encouraging. So I don't think it'll help us to wring our hands and to say, oh my goodness, the sky is falling. But these kinds of moments invite greater candor, I think, with this congregation. Some people seem to think that the church just exists because God loves us very much and nothing else needs to happen. I don't need to write a check. I don't need to put my credit card in, and that just isn't true. It isn't true of any institution. And I'll invite people in this period of time to prioritize the ministries of the church and to make St. Bart's the number one recipient of their philanthropic giving.
So going along with the pastoral care question, there's also a question about funerals. We've seen these horrifying pictures of refrigerated trucks at hospitals. We've heard about mass graves being used in the city. How can we honor and recognize the dead in this time? We say all of us go down to the dust pit, even at the grave we make our song, Alleluia, Alleluia. How do we rightfully mourn the dead who are dying, whether of COVID-19 or otherwise?
Well, it's the mark of a society. The way they care for their dead says a great deal about their respect for life in general. My heart goes out, having been a hospital chaplain. I can only imagine the stresses and strains that chaplains and medical professionals are dealing with a large number of deaths and trying to find reverent ways of dealing with the body after death, but being really overwhelmed. We are postponing funerals that deaths that take place in our community. We will do funerals at the end of this time, but we will also. Bill Hawthorne, who was just a beloved member of this community, when he died, there was a Zoom meeting, kind of a Zoom wake, and I wondered in some ways if that didn't serve as a really wonderful funeral in some ways for him. It was not liturgical per se, but it was people sharing memories of him and expressing their love and their sense of loss. And I would never have imagined such a thing a couple of months ago, but I found it personally really reassuring to be able to share my grief with others who were experiencing loss. This is one of the hardest things in this time. There is a powerful healing quality to the funeral liturgies and to the sense of time that when someone dies and family gather and friends gather and the story is retold, the inability to do that immediately is heartbreaking. And so we have to find new ways to actually respond.
So there's a question about our theological view on healing and suffering. It's hard not to engage the horror of everything that's happening and not feel helpless. And it can also, I know from a sort of religious practitioner standpoint, I remember at the early days of this sitting with my colleagues and saying, how do we explain this theologically? In the Gospels, Jesus kind of instantaneously heals people. One of the ways in which we've talked about healing in the context of the church is with laying on of hands, and we can't do that because of social distancing. How do you make sense of how healing happens and God's response to suffering?
Well, we will never again take for granted simple gestures like being able to touch someone and to make the sign of the cross on someone's forehead. And those are really powerful experiences, both for clergy and also the people receiving those signs. I was really sick in seminary. I had appendicitis and my appendix removed, and I was really scared. And I'll never forget a priest coming and praying with me and making the sign of the cross on my forehead. And in that moment, I thought, this is going to be okay. And it was simple but powerful. We're going to have to use other ways of communicating that kind of healing, and to make sure that people know that they are being prayed for. We've had other things and in our lives, nothing quite like this, but the other losses and the other tragedies in our lives do in some ways gird us for this particular challenge.
So there's a question about our how we can structure our days these days, because we mentioned sort of being able to pray from home, have a routine. What kind of reading do you recommend? What daily rituals do you recommend in terms of spiritual structuring?
Well, the prayer book, one of the things that I loved about coming to the Episcopal Church was this I'd been told all of my life that you should pray daily, but nobody had ever given me forms for that or ways to do that. And, the Book of Common Prayer, which you can find online if you don't have a copy of it, there are forms for morning prayer and evening prayer. And several parishioners have told me that in these days that they have gone back to that prayerful habit. And I think that can be a very powerful way of starting your day with prayer, of closing your day with prayer. There's a lot of unstructured time when you're at home, and I know that for a lot of people who are working from home, they're spending all day in front of a screen. They're doing one Zoom meeting after another. They're on the phone. They find themselves being more exhausted than if they had gone into the workplace. So the idea of beginning the day and closing the day with prayer, I think, is a powerful one, and it takes us back to our roots, because this is the way the early church went about living their day.
So there are a few questions about Crossroads. seeing if you could give any insight to what's happening with Crossroads. There's also a question about folks who feel nervous about volunteering, but also an obligation to volunteer, and how they kind of square those feelings within themselves.
I know. Well, the work that Crossroads has done during this period of time has been, I use the word heroic, and I don't think that's exaggeration. People have gone. We've tried to be very smart about the risks that are taken. People now just pick up bags of food for takeout. We try to reduce the amount of contact. The staff has been working to follow protocols. But it's wow, it's a challenge. It's just really hard, and some people who have pre-existing conditions or who are older probably shouldn't volunteer. But that also makes it more difficult to find volunteers that can do this safely. It's a very near thing, and we're struggling to keep that ministry open. This past week, they closed the shelter because they just felt like they didn't have the volunteers and couldn't maintain that ministry safely. And the food pantry has been discontinued, but the feeding program has continued. And we don't know how long we'll be able to do that, because volunteers need to feel safe, and we need to be able to assure their safety. So I think the Crossroads team is working very hard to establish that.
And our Director of Giving, Megan Corbett, reminds us that if you're not able to volunteer, you can always give money. And that is a very real way in which you can have an impact.
Well, it is. It's not insignificant. A lot of the food that is distributed by Crossroads comes to us from restaurants and is recovered food that is not used by law firms and other entities. And all of that has all of those ways of getting food has kind of dried up. So yes. A check to Crossroads Community Services would be very welcomed in this time, and may be just as important as volunteering in person.
We have a few minutes left, so I encourage you, if you have a final question, to write that in or email that in now.
Peter is supposed to be screening all the difficult questions so that I don't, get stumped here and embarrassed.
You don't always get to interview your boss, so I'm I'm relishing the opportunity. This is a time of resurrection, and one person asked, how will St. Bart's be different after COVID-19, once all of the social distancing restrictions have been lifted? And I was reading an Atlantic article the other day from Ben Rhodes that said this is no longer a post 9/11 world, that COVID-19 will be this turning point for a lot of society, including the church, and how we don't know for sure when this will end and how far out there that will be and what exactly will happen between now and then. But how will we be different?
Boy, what an interesting question, and I invite you to think about that with me. We'll have some opportunity to be talking about that. Well, certainly the use of technology is going to change us. I don't think the streaming ministries, the taping ministries that we're doing will discontinue when we're able to get back together. We have always had a lot of parishioners who live a ways away, or who spend part of their time in the city and part of their time somewhere else, who travel for business. I think that we will be able to offer them a connection to St. Bart's that we haven't had before. And I think that you will see not just St. Bart's, but many churches responding in a similar fashion. I'm hoping that people will be reminded of the preciousness of being together in person in worship. My fantasy as a rector is that thousands of people will flock to church, having been prevented from attending church. But I kind of doubt that it will happen that way. I think that it'll be a slower kind of recovery of our normal patterns. But my prayer would be that people will not take attendance in worship for granted, that they will see that it has a value for them, and it has a value for the rest of the community of faith. Whenever we come to church, we are encouraging other people just by our presence. And I hope people will cherish that and not just think of it as an obligation or a duty.
So we made the decision to postpone the Easter Vigil. It's still Easter. We're celebrating Easter with some fanfare this morning, although being very well aware of the tragedy that's happening around us. But we didn't have our sort of big signature characteristic liturgy. I know your favorite liturgy of the year. Can you talk about what that was like to postpone that, and also what your hopes are for the Vigil when we're able to do it?
I think I've made, and I'm not making these decisions unilaterally, but in conversation with the wardens and the vestry and the clergy staff. But I think in this period, I've made more consequential decisions, difficult decisions than I have in all my years of ministry. The decision to do the live streaming and potentially put some people at risk, the decision to keep the Crossroads doors open and to keep the building open so that ministry could continue, understanding the risk there. It's and the Easter Vigil, that's like that is my it is my favorite service, because if you wanted to introduce someone to the Christian faith, if they came to that service, they would get an experience of the great stories of the liturgy and the very moment where we celebrate the resurrection. But I didn't want to do that poorly. We've had increasing enthusiasm each year for the way that we've been doing the Easter Vigil. And I really would rather save it and have it be a time when everybody can join in than to do it badly by live stream. I also was challenged to think how we would be able to do it with all the people that it takes. And we're still learning how to do the editing. My gosh, Kara Flannery, our communications director, has been doing extraordinary work, but she's needed some help in putting all these liturgies together. And the Stations of the Cross and the Good Friday liturgy, I think that kind of maxed our capacity. So I'll look forward to that as much as anything in the coming year.
Well, we're coming to a close. What you haven't been able to see, I've brought you all the questions, but what you haven't been able to see in the comments is the great amount of love and gratitude people are showing for St. Bart's and their lives, especially this Easter. And I'm just wondering if you want to send any love back in their direction. We now have almost 100 people watching between the two.
Wow. Well, 100 people in the adult forum, I think we consider that a pretty good number.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons that I try not to be anxious about the finances is because I know the ways in which this congregation loves and cherishes their church. People give sacrificially of time and tithe and talent. And we are so, I think I would be speaking for the entire staff to say, we feel very privileged. We feel blessed to work in a community of faith like this. And we've been getting a lot of support. After every live stream service, people have written in and said, we really appreciate you doing that. Thank you so much. You know, there's no way I could tell you how much that means to us. If you appreciate what we're doing, know that we appreciate what you're doing. Your prayers for us, your financial support for us, your encouragement to us means the world, and we thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean. We have to get you downstairs and get you ready to preach your Easter sermon. But thank you for taking the time to do this morning, and thank you all out there for watching us. We'll see you in worship in just a few minutes.
Now, you may not do this at St. Bart's, but you know, if you're at home and you feel the desire to say amen or praise Jesus at any point in the sermon, just have at it.
We'll see you very soon.
All right. God bless you all.